All right, everybody, I'm Chris Cuomo. I'm the guy who says, let's get after it. Certainly got to be where our heads and hearts are right now. If we don't do what we're supposed to do, even if that means not doing things, forbearance, self-isolation, this virus isn't going to go anywhere. It's our only way to beat it down, just like every other virus. So, my job is to give you perspective on the facts, give you the information, help you make the right decisions. To do that, we've got a great guest here at the top of the hour. His name is Guy Snodgrass. Okay, he is retired U.S. Navy commander, former chief speechwriter to Secretary Mattis, author of Holding the Line, Inside Trump's Pentagon with Secretary Mattis. First of all, Guy, thank you very much for joining us. Commander, I appreciate your service, and I welcome you to this show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. Good to be with you.
No, it's a pleasure. First question that will indulge people's almost constant political question for people in your position when you were representing Secretary Mattis. Let's get this out of the way, and then we'll get into the specific about COVID, which is Mattis and Kelly and these other people that we believe and respect. Why didn't they do more when they were in there to check the president and call him out on all the things that nobody believed? From your perspective, in-house, where were the priorities and what were the factors pushing what was said and not said at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you strike at the crux of what all Americans wrestle with, because you're right. There's about half the country, it seems, that feels no matter who you are, what your background is, if President Trump asks you to come into his administration and serve, that you carry out his directions or his orders without fail. You just execute. On the other hand, the other half of the country seems to have this perspective that your job, their job, my job was to check the president's impulse or to help prevent disaster. And I would tell you that as everything in life, it's always somewhere in the middle. Yes, President Trump brought these individuals you mentioned, along with Nikki Haley and many, many others, Secretary of State Tillerson. And these were individuals, especially in that first wave, who had a deep knowledge of foreign policy, of national security, of effective governance. And what I think as we look back through the lens of history, and I do this to a limited extent in my book, as you look back through that period of time and the period of time we're going through now, you will find that these were men and women who they walked a tightrope. They wanted to apply their expertise. They wanted to provide their best counsel and guidance to the president. At the same time, when he came down and said, this is what we're going to do, get after it, then they needed to shift gears. He was elected president. They were not. They were appointed to serve in his administration. And so they're always going to be trying to go through that dance. And I think what you've seen over time is people have cycled into and out of the administration. You've had people who have more closely aligned themselves with the president's stated desires. And I think that over time, that's not necessarily served our country well.
Why not?
So, you mentioned at the top of the hour when you introduced me that I'd had more than 2 decades of service in the United States Navy. I was a fighter pilot for a majority of my time. I was a squadron commander. I've been a Top Gun instructor. So, throughout that path, you learn that the number one thing that really, really matters, whether it's a time of crisis like we find ourselves in now or steady state, it's leadership. It's this ability for men and women in positions of authority to do what's right for the individuals they lead, to put service before self. And I think what you've seen over time is the president he certainly has a cunning eye for what sells, what sounds good. We've watched this, as I've heard you on the show talk about, with some of his recent briefings from the podium at the White House, talking about the COVID-19 outbreak. And he's good about shaping public perception, especially for certain audiences. The problem is that when you surround yourself with people who are yes men or yes women, you're not going to really be getting the best advice and counsel that you need to make an informed decision. And so, obviously from my vantage point, from Secretary Mattis' vantage point, other senior leaders who I served with, it was a lot like President Lincoln's team of rivals. You wanted to surround yourself by people from different backgrounds with different perspectives, people who would not only challenge you, but challenge each other to come up with the best result for the organization. In this case, when we're talking about the current situation, you want the best result for the nation, for all Americans, not just for one small constituency. And when you surround yourself with people who think like you and only want to make you happy, by definition, you're not going to get the full sounding of what you need to hear to make informed decisions.
And that's what we're dealing with now. So let's do this. I know you're not there, obviously, and I don't really, it's more important for me to project what could be going on there now than to take you through earlier episodes that aren't necessarily relevant to what we're dealing with right now. So let's just deal with a scenario that happened and give me your best sense, Commander, in terms of how this would play out in the White House. So the president comes out and says, we're good for Easter. Love Easter. Love the idea of full churches at Easter. We've been doing this long enough. Cure is worse than the problem. Problem is the problem, whatever that means. And that's what I'm looking at. And then we hear that he goes to the task force and his people, or somebody does, probably Jared Kushner, and says, start figuring out how to make that happen. Now, how does that reverberate, given what we understand as the factual premise, which is no one agrees with that as a goal or as a reasonable assessment of where we're headed? Now what happens? How does it work in there?
So what you're addressing is something I touched on earlier, and that is leadership matters all the time. Leadership matters in untold ways when it's a moment of crisis, because you need to be seen as someone who has credibility and capability to do the job. So obviously, depending on how your political winds blow, people could take that any way they want. But I would tell you that the past is instructive to the present, because there has been a consistent theme of not having a plan, and people want to see that consistent vision. They want to see that leadership. So when you stand up and say, we're going to be open for business by Easter, I'm hearing, and I know that my medical professionals, the ones who really understand what we're facing, they're also talking, and they're telling Americans that the problem will only get worse for the foreseeable future, and likely, based on what they've told us, we're going to continue to spike upwards rapidly over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And that's right in that timeline. So that's the danger for all Americans is there's a lack of consistency. And we've seen that over the last 3.5 years. It's something that bothers me as a retired senior leader, is that it's one of those problems that's avoidable. You can.
But how do you avoid it? So, Commander, so he comes to you. So they come to you. You're in there. And they say, you got to work up a plan for how we mobilize to get the economy open in 2 weeks. And now you look at your staff and they all say, you can't open in 2 weeks. That's crazy. We can't do that. That's when the cases are supposed to be spiking. Why would we do this? Now what do you do?
Yeah, so now you're at the moment of crisis. It's basically triage. So something I told the fighter pilots in my squadron was, you've always got to be thinking 300 miles and 30 minutes in front of your aircraft, right? The biggest danger you could make, especially as someone who takes off and lands from a aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean, is to suddenly start thinking about what you're going to do next right then, because now you're behind the jet, as we would say, you're unprepared, and that's when dangerous situations arise. Well, unfortunately, we're already there. We have seen reporting even today that there was a pandemic response plan that had been kicking around in the White House and the National Security Council for the last 4 years. It was available, and it's obvious we're not following it. So we are where we are. And what I would say is you need to basically split your staff. You need to have your medical professionals. You need to have your economic response team. A lot of the people you've seen in the media, they all need to be working the immediate problem about how do you get America through this critical moment of the next few weeks.
But what factor of it is it? What fact, just so I can keep people focused on like what their confusion is in this, is that how does it work, or is there a possibility in this particular presidency, okay, and not other chains of command that you have, not just how it would have been with you and Secretary General Mattis, that what is the ability of people around this president to communicate that what he wants to do is either unfounded or unreasonable? Like, how does that dynamic work? Because, and just for me to lift the curtain a little bit, I'm asking this question as if I don't know the answer. And that's not really fair, because obviously I talk to people in there all the time, but they don't want my perspective on what I'm told. They want yours. And I know that this is going on right now a lot around the president, and they're trying to get him to stop saying things that they're going to have to own, and they don't want to own because it's going to hurt their credibility, and they're going to need their credibility, especially when this hits a next wave of what they have to tell the American people. So What did that look like from your perspective, where you're being told something to act on something that you know either doesn't make sense or is founded on a non-factual premise? What do you do in that situation?
Right. So I'm going to take 10 seconds to finish my last thought, which was
you have
to have that immediate response team, and you also have to have simultaneously individuals who are thinking 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 9 weeks into the future to help the immediate crisis team so that they can actually put forward a plan instead of just responding to contact. Now, to your point about, okay, so you have these experts, people who know maybe the decision they're seeing is not in the best interest. What do you do? The reality is what you're seeing play out now is the same thing you've seen play out for the last 3.5 years with Secretary Mattis and others. You are faced with a choice. You work as diligently as you can to share information, to share facts with the commander-in-chief to help inform that decision-making process. He's made it very clear at the end of the day, he's the decider. He makes a decision. The federal government aligns to him. So you're right. You have to maintain your credibility. That the dangerous dance that everyone has had to play is that unless you align with where he wants to go, your credibility is automatically diminished. We've seen this play out in recent days with Dr. Fauci, who was Legion. He was everywhere, and then he's been diminished recently because he was seen as getting out in front of the president or counteracting what the president was saying. And that's the danger. And so in the military, we'd say at some point you have to make a determination if you're no longer in a position to do what you know is right, then you either have to fall on your sword, which means you basically say, look, I know this is wrong. I'm resigning. I know this is wrong. I'm going public. Or you get stuck in that middle where you just have to keep on plugging, doing the best job you possibly can on behalf of the American public. So basically you're trying to reconcile irreconcilable issues.
Tough spot. Now, look, not tough spot the way the media portrays it all the time, because sometimes policy choices are policy choices. This is what the president wants to do. He was elected. I wasn't. It's not illegal. And whether or not I think it's wrong, it's not it, especially as a military commander or a military man or woman with that background, is that there's been a lot of things you've been told to do that you might have not done the right way. It's not how chain of command works. Totally understandable, often abused by the media in terms of making it sound like a no-brainer that you would just step up and tell a president that they're wrong. And certainly so many members of the media, when put in that position with this president, have not been nearly as forthcoming as they are when they're talking about him. They're certainly not the same way when they're talking to him. It is different when you are sitting across from the most powerful man in the world in terms of what you say and don't say. Everybody's brave with distance. But so with what we're dealing with now, we have the country in a very weird place. I don't think we've been here together before, which is, this sucks, Commander. Tired of this.
Oh, yeah.
Don't want to stay here. Don't want to do this. I'm not even sick. No one around me is sick. I think this is like some weird New York funky germ thing, California, big places, population centers, sure, but the president's right. We should get back. Easter's a beautiful time, rebirth and renewal. Sounds good to me. This is killing our economy. And for what? We've only lost 1,000 people, 2,000 people. It's nothing. How do you deal with that from a public policy perspective when you have guys and the women who know everything saying, no, that would be the worst thing. We can't do that. Look at Hong Kong. That's what they did, and their cases doubled. How do you deal with that from a policy perspective?
Well, from a policy perspective, I think the number one thing any leader can provide is consistency and vision. So it's always easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, but if you look back, say, 3-4 weeks ago, imagine the alternative to today's concern, dysfunction. No one really knows and has a solid view of what's going on because you're hearing so many different points to what you just said. Medical professionals saying one thing, the president and his team saying another. Of course, on each side of the political aisle, you're seeing a spectrum of responses. So if you'd had the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States, take the podium a month ago and say, we are watching what's happening overseas. There is no doubt in my mind that it will be heading to our shores. It's already starting to crop up in other places. I've taken decisive action to close off flights coming in from China. That's not the only thing we need to do. We need to start thinking like this. You started to prepare people's mindset. You get everyone focused. You go hard over. If you have major news outlets saying that this is a hoax, it's fake, and say, no, it's actually not. This is very real. It's going to take Americans pulling together. It's going to take the traditional American resolve. Something you just mentioned that I think is what bothers so many people, is because it's, as the president has said, that invisible enemy. It feels like you can't do something. Americans are all about community. We're all about responding in a positive way during crisis. I love the way you've covered this over the last couple of weeks, where you talked about pulling together, La Familia, the sense of community. And I think that when you look back at other issues we face, whether it's Pearl Harbor or Katrina, anytime we meet a crisis, 9/11, it was very easy for us to pull together as a community and really start focusing on how are we going to pull ourselves through this period of time. Right now, that's difficult because everyone's isolated. They're separated. And so you need to have that centralized leadership that's saying, this is difficult. The economy will recover, whether it's in 1 month, whether it's in 6 months, whether it's in a year. It's going to come back. We're America. But the most important thing to do now is to keep the men and women, our family, the people in our community safe from this, because we don't have the immunity. And you just have to be consistent and be clear and communicate that unfailingly, so that everyone, whether it takes a day or a week, begins to realize, this is what we need to do. And now all of us can now get behind that. We can align with where we're going. But if you hear that same individual tell you one day that it's a hoax, the next day it's a crisis, the next day it's going to be open for business, I think understandably men and women around our country find themselves facing whiplash, and they're not quite sure what action they should be taking, and they're not quite sure about the severity of what they're facing.
Absolutely, but nobody ever is until they're getting punched in the face. As you've seen so often. It's one thing when it's somebody else; it's another when it's you. Again, just for the audience joining now, we have Commander Snodgrass with us. He worked very closely with Secretary General Mattis, working on speech writing. But obviously, speech writing does not convey what the job is. The job is, how do you make message? How do you compel policy? How do you communicate need? How do you deal with leadership and language? Being a speechwriter is, especially somebody like the commander, the guy who's a fighter pilot and Top Gun instructor. Someone like me is a speechwriter. That is the least of this man's credentials that you're listening to right now, as somebody who gave decades of his life to the service of us in our country in the military. So the biggest concern you have right now from a messaging perspective in the COVID situation is what?
The biggest concern I have right now is the seeming all-clear signal that's been sent up in the past few days. The frustration that's being felt in the administration, the frustration being felt in the White House, that we wanted to stiff-arm this problem. It's been proven we can't do that. Now we're going to respond forcefully. We're going to get everybody to social distance. We're going to follow the president's 15-day plan. And you get a few days into that, and you realize this has real ramifications for the economics, for the economy of our country. And so now we need to reverse course once again, and we need to get people back to work as soon as possible. We need to get the $2 trillion plan. It's chaotic. And you can operate, and maybe, Chris, you've been in a situation where you've been part of an organization, and it moves fast, and you have to be responsive, and that's okay in small groups. When you're leading 350 million Americans, you can't move that fast. Your message needs to be consistent, it needs to be clear, and you need to have that vision as you look forward so that everyone understands there's an end to this. There's a goal in sight that we're all pulling towards, and if you change that message too rapidly, and it's constantly morphing, one, no one can get behind it because you're constantly shifting gears on them. And the second thing is, well, what's most important? Is it most important to help save American lives? Is it most important to restart the economy? If it's the economy, then obviously COVID-19 is not the concern that we thought it was. And it's just very difficult for people who have not operated in a very high-pressure environment to get aligned. And that's what you want right now. You want everybody aligned. You want everyone fighting in the same direction so that we can get through this as swiftly as possible and move forward. And I'll tell you that I think we're already seeing the ramifications of this. Even today, there's been reporting. I think it's interesting to see what we're saying inside America, but you need to read articles from BBC in England. You need to read stuff that's coming out from Brussels, where NATO is, to see how they're perceiving us. And you're already seeing articles about how countries are starting to close their borders to Americans because we're likely becoming, either today or tomorrow, the epicenter for COVID-19. And therefore, we're going to find it's going to be difficult to reestablish entry into those countries because now we're the problem. So again, you want that clear, consistent message so we can fight this.
All right, but we don't have that, and we're not going to have it because that's not the way this president works. And I'm not saying that as a criticism because I have said this, certainly before now on the show, and hopefully you have better things to do than be monitoring what I say on a regular basis. But ultimately, we're going to get through this. Ultimately, the federal response, you only remember how things end. It's a little bit in psychology, the primacy-recency struggle. Primacy is what happens first. Recency is what happens most recently, and we favor recency in a big way in crisis. So we're going to come through this, and there are going to be a lot of moves made, and there will be a lot of celebration at the end of it about it ending one way or another. That will inure to the benefit of the president, and rightly so. Why? Because presidents get credit for things that wind up okay on their watch. Right, wrong, that is often the political reality. Doesn't have to be. There are aberrations. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way, but most often it does. Even if you feel that this president has gotten that success wrongly or that we have succeeded despite him instead of because of him, I'm telling you, you will see in polls and reflections of feelings that people will wind up capturing the president in their feelings about how we got through this. So politically, I'm telling you, that's the way I think it winds up. If you don't like it, you can call me, but don't bother Commander Snodgrass with that right now. I'll take it on after him because he doesn't deserve that. But that said, you're not going to have the message consistency. And my concern is that now that you've been inside and now that you've been outside, so you have full perspective, how beat up do you think our institutions and media are? Because of what's been going on the last few years, and as that translates into our ability to effectively communicate and lead people now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind. I've had plenty of conversations with, like you, I've got friends still in the administration, both at the White House, at the Pentagon, State Department. So, I mean, I'm routinely talking with them. I'm also talking with some friends that I've made throughout the stops we went through around the globe, right? So their perspective back on America, how do they see us? There's no doubt in my mind. I mean, because of the chaos and the decision making, right? So you can disagree, to your point, Chris, with politics or with policies. What you can't disagree with is a chaotic nature, or much like the beginning of COVID-19, where you unilaterally put travel restrictions in place before you even consulted your allies and partners. That's something that for decades we've done. That has a real impact. When you start burning those bridges with your allies and partners, as we've done for a few years now, I think we'll see that at some point in the future, when we need that level of support back, we're not going to get it. And the same thing with the media. The biggest concern I have heard from members of the military, stationed, of course, globally, across the United States, friends, family, everybody, is they don't know what to believe. And again, that's the danger of the mixed messages. That's the danger of saying that that's the danger of disinformation, as you well know, because you're fighting that each and every day. So you're right. There's a strategic top level. What would I be advising the president if I were helping his communications team at the White House? 100%. It would be, we've got to get in front of the messaging. We've got to provide that stability, consistency on the path forward, and we've got to do it in an unwavering fashion so everyone can align. Now, more importantly, it goes back to, I think, what you said previously, which is, in the military, we'd say you have to focus on your span of control. If I'm the commanding officer of a fighter squadron, that's what I can control. I can't control the air wing. I can't control what the aircraft carrier is doing. That's somebody else's job. But I can control my squadron. So what can each and every one of us who are listening to your show today, what can we do? Well, we can focus on our span of control. We can stay positive. We can focus on ourselves, staying healthy. In some cases, frankly, since a lot of people are not being currently affected by COVID-19, this is an opportunity. I mean, you can actually use this as an opportunity to leap ahead, to think, what do I need to do for myself, for my family, for my community as I move forward? And, of course, there's that most immediate of there are ways we can all pitch in and we can all contribute, even if we are, stifled in our homes or we're social distancing. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can engage within our span of control to be a positive part of not only the immediate task at hand, but that long-term recovery that I've heard you talk about. Yeah,
I mean, that's my concern is that my friends, I have a lot of people in my life who are Trump supporters, you hear this all the time. I don't like what he says. I don't like what he tweets. But I like some of the things that he has done. Either it's of a cultural thing where they're worried about undocumented people flooding their workforce, even though they're all hiring these guys, and they just like the muscularity of it, even if it was a little misplaced at time. And now they're starting to go sideways. But these guys will say to me, and these are the same guys who are supporting my family right now when I'm not around. So these are my friends, and I know that you know. Commander, I deal with this all the time where people beat up on me for criticizing the president, and they beat up on me for having too many of his supporters on. So, but I always tell people in journalism, if you're in it for popularity, you must really be a masochist, because that's just not how the business works. But they say to me, hey, man, is this real? This stuff, like, stuff you're seeing on TV, is it real? Are these cases really going on? I mean, I know your brother, I fished with him. Is this true, what he's saying? Like, and they mean it. They're not being wise asses. They're not, suggesting that I'd be lying to them on TV. They literally have been conditioned to believe that what is reported, even by a guy who they know, and like they know me, not hi bye, they know me, these guys. We've been together for dozens and dozens of hours next to each other. That's where we are right now, where they are very open to the suggestion that anything can be fake at any time, including, most of all, what comes out of the mouth of a president they support. I've never seen anything like it.
No, nor have I. And so this kind of goes back to my background as a military strategist, as a military officer and leader. That concerns me deeply, because your point earlier was fantastic. We have short-term memories. I mean, that's just the tendency for Americans writ large. I myself suffer from that. I have to force myself to get back into the history books to consider what happened with previous, whether it was economic crashes or pandemics or military conflicts. How did we handle these in decades and even hundreds of years past, to provide context for the current day? But if I am looking at the state of America right now, and I'm China, if I'm Russia, if I'm Iran or North Korea, I love what I'm seeing. Because that unity of purpose, that kind of clear, I have a sense of what America is, what we stand for, and when I hear something, I can believe it. We can all rally around the flag. That is, I believe, quickly dissipating, and it gives points of entry to the nations I just mentioned to continue to foster disinformation, to exploit that down the road. Because, again, we're Americans. We're fighting through this battle with COVID-19 right now, and we are laser focused on the task at hand. We're not, quite frankly, thinking about much else. But I guarantee you, military planners and senior leaders in those nations I just mentioned are watching us with great interest, because this is a tremendous vulnerability for America. The fact that, as you just said, we question authority, we question the information we're receiving. It's going to make it very difficult, and in the next time of crisis, especially if it's something overseas, for us to want to rally around the flag, because we're going to automatically feel like we're going to have to distrust the information. And it's going to make that common sense of unity and purpose much more difficult to achieve. And I think that's what we're going to find over the next 5 to 10 years is the biggest change from this, not just COVID-19, but this administration, this moment in time, is that it really knocked us down several pegs from our ability to operate with unity. There's always been politics. There's always been these other things that have occurred, and that's a given. But when you start to distrust everything you hear, you're in a dangerous place. Who do you trust? Who can you go to?
Especially now. When I thought what was going to hit us with was Iran. When the Iran thing happened, I was like, oh, no, because now the president is going to have to communicate things that everybody accepts, and we already got a little bit of, residual stink on that from what happened back with the Iraq war intelligence and Colin Powell and all the things that you and I are old enough to have lived through, and a lot of the people who are processing politics today barely remember. And I was like, oh, boy, there's already a little bit of a basis of suspicion for my generation. But now we got to believe what he says, and I hope that the generals come out. And then, of course, thank God it didn't really manifest itself that way, except in the idea of an imminent threat, which, of course, once again, he kind of co-opted and made into a confusion it didn't need to be. But now it's like that with everything, Commanders. Even this, I got to tell you, I don't know what it will take, but I know it's going to be something bad that reminds people to get back to the basics of what we choose to believe and we don't. And I hate that. But maybe, look, you're the student of history. Is that just the reality that what teaches us the most hardest lessons are things born of hardship and failure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if any of us look back through our lives, it's the times where you face personal adversity, personal hardship. I can tell you right now, as a military leader, as I was coming up through the ranks, the lessons that stood up and still stand out to me the most are the ones where I had a horrible boss or someone who was just terrible. They mistreated the people that they were responsible for taking care of. Instead of being a leader who leads through inspiration, they would lead by intimidation and harm. And you find yourself looking back going, how in the world could you operate that way? But it leaves you with a lesson that you will never forget. And I can tell you, I never forgot those lessons, and it impacted how I served when I rose to more senior levels of leadership, making sure that I was being the leader that when I was junior, that I thought that my men and women who I was responsible for needed to see, someone who could support them, support their families, push them forward to achieve things they never thought possible. I think we're going to see the same thing here. It's just going to require at some point, and when you look back through history, the arc of history, it's a pendulum, right? It swings back and forth. We'll kind of swing out to one extreme, and then it'll hang there for a little bit, and then we'll start to swing back the other direction. So I think at some point in the future, we will not only bounce back from COVID-19, we're going to bounce back from this era of misinformation, this era of kind of chaotic leadership and frankly, a lot of disinformation. It's just there's going to have to be that recognition that we've got to make that turn back, because as a nation, it can be fun. You know, if I'm turning on the TV and I want to settle into my couch and watch a reality TV show because I want to be entertained, that's one thing. But I really like it. I enjoy it when the leaders that are in charge of my future and are working on my behalf are boring. I love boring leaders who, are working diligently behind the scenes, are putting service before self. They are putting, the betterment and wellness of others before their own personal gain. And I don't have to think about them. And I think that at some point in the not too distant future, we will get back to that state of affairs, and that pendulum will begin to swing back.
That would be nice. Be tougher to cover, and I welcome that challenge. Commander, thank you so much. You've been listening to retired U.S. Navy commander, former chief speechwriter.